even a small number of nuclear weapons, if they can be credibly delivered, is a more than credible deterrent.
We will measure our success not only by the battles we win, but also by the wars we end.
The U.S. will take over the Gaza Strip. We'll own it. Know that China is doing very poorly right now. I just saw some reports coming out, and I don't want that to happen to China. You're gambling with World War III. I was saved by God to make America great again.
I'm Venetia Rainey, and this is Battlelines. It's Friday, 7th of August, 2025. Nuclear weapons are back. In the last few months alone, Israel has bombed Iran to prevent it from developing nuclear weapons. The UK has announced plans to improve its nuclear posture and struck a cooperation agreement with France. And it's emerged that China is growing its stockpile of nuclear warheads at a faster rate than any other country. Just last week, President Donald Trump invoked America's nuclear weapons by announcing that he had moved nuclear submarines towards Russia. And this week, Moscow announced that it was withdrawing from what was left of the once hugely significant Intermediate-Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov said, "Russia no longer has any limitations." This all comes as Japan marks a grim 80th anniversary this week, the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It was an attack that ended the Second World War, but killed 200,000 people in the process and continues to haunt thousands more survivors to this day. Here's one such survivor, Coco Kondo, speaking to American radio station NPR a few years ago.
But at that time, no one knew how to cure or no medicine, nothing. We didn't know that there was radiation. So we did not go away. We stayed in Hiroshima City. As a child, I thought if they never dropped the bomb, many children didn't have to, become an orphan. So I said, someday when I'm grown up, I am going to revenge.
At an event this week to mark 80 years since the bombing of Hiroshima, the city's mayor warned that there was a global accelerating trend towards military buildup and the idea that nuclear weapons are essential for national defence. He said this was a flagrant disregard of the lessons the international community should have learned from the tragedies of history. And he's not alone. More than 120 Nobel Prize laureates and 60 leading nuclear experts recently signed a declaration calling for immediate action. They said that time and the law of probability are not on our side when it comes to a nuclear catastrophe. So how did we get to this point where stories such as Coco's are apparently ignored? What's driving this new nuclear arms race? And is there an argument that it actually makes the world safer? To discuss all of this, I'm joined in the studio by Dr Sidharth Kaushal, a senior fellow in military sciences at the Royal United Services Institute in London. Sidharth, welcome to Battlelines. I want to start with a really basic question. What is a nuclear weapon?
So a nuclear weapon can essentially take two forms, a fission device or a fusion device. They tend to vary in terms of things like their yield, amongst other things. Different nuclear weapons can have yields ranging from a few kilotons up to, hundreds of kilotons. And of course, they can also vary in terms of their delivery mechanisms, which is relevant, not necessarily in terms of the outcome, but in terms of things like the warning time that another side might be given if one is launched.
And who has nuclear weapons? Which are the countries in the world that have them, and who has the most?
Russia and the United States have by far the largest arsenals of nuclear weapons, although China is rapidly catching up in this respect. There are several other smaller nuclear states, the UK, France, Israel, India, and Pakistan, as well as states like North Korea, which maintain nuclear arsenals in contravention of pretty significant international pressure. But really, at least for now, at least until the middle of the next decade, Russia and the United States maintain by far the largest arsenals.
Yeah, I've got some numbers in front of me here from the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. And they cite that Russia and the United States both have over 5,000. And then the third most, which you said, China, has 600. So it's quite a stark difference, isn't it? And we should also add Israel, which has never openly declared that it has nuclear weapons, but is widely believed to have them.
It is quite a stark difference. difference. Although, of course, at least for as long as New START remains in force, the numbers of deployed warheads that each side maintains is a comparatively small fraction of their total capacity, around 1,550 in total. So in that respect, the gulf between China, Russia, and the US is already narrowed quite significantly, and will probably narrow further come 2030 when China becomes 1,000 warhead power.
So by deployed nuclear warheads, you mean ones that are ready to go, not ones that are sort of sitting around in storage and would have to be loaded up into a missile?
Precisely, yes.
And all of China's 600 nuclear weapons, those are deployed warheads?
No. So China as well, until quite recently, has maintained a nuclear posture where a significant portion of its nuclear arsenal is maintained in central storage sites. So this is consistent with China's minimum deterrent posture, whereby the idea is not so much being able to ride out a first strike and be able to deliver a significant number of warheads against an adversary society in a way that both Russia and the United States planned to do and still planned during the Cold War and still plan to. The Chinese view has always, at least until recently, has been even a small number of nuclear weapons, if they can be credibly delivered, it is a more than credible deterrent. So, quantitative thresholds like the 400 warhead McNamara criterion, which was the US's planning assumption during the Cold War, meant very little to the Chinese. And so centralized storage, which of course enables both political control and escalation management, was quite important to the Chinese. That's likely to be changing now, however, for a variety of reasons, as China builds up its nuclear arsenal for several different reasons, and there are competing explanations as to why this is happening. But the salient point is that China isn't restricted in the same way that Russia and the US are, and so its posture can change in this regard quite quickly. And you mentioned a word there, deterrence, and that has been the sort of thinking behind nuclear weapons for a while now. Can you just explain what we mean when we say a nuclear deterrence? The nuclear deterrence is quite simply the use of an adversary's fear regarding what one's own employment of nuclear weapons would entail in order to dissuade some action by the opponent. Now, I'd say any nuclear deterrent implicitly is expected to deter an adversary's use of nuclear weapons. That's kind of a common factor or a common criteria. But it doesn't necessarily extend purely to the use of nuclear weapons to deter an adversary's nuclear weapons. So, for example, during the Cold War, the US's and NATO's nuclear weapons were also intended to deter the Soviets from launching a conventional war in Europe, because the Red Army enjoyed pretty substantial and arguably insurmountable advantages in terms of numbers of troops on the ground. And so it was assumed that at some point in a conflict, should it occur, tactical nuclear weapons would have to be employed in order to stop the Red Army. And the threat that this would occur was a deterrent against conventional conflict. So nuclear deterrence doesn't necessarily only extend to constraining an opponent's ability to use their own nuclear weapons.
And it makes nuclear weapons in some ways sort of slightly different from other types of weapons, because they're always working when they're not being used. And I suppose if they do have to be used, then they've failed in a respect.
Absolutely. Nuclear weapons have an enormous latent power. And in that respect, you're quite right. They are, as tools of deterrence, most useful precisely when they are not used. So, this is a point that, academics and theorists of deterrence during the Cold War, people like Glenn Snyder, pointed out that nuclear weapons had in some ways fundamentally changed the way defense planning occurs, because prior to the nuclear revolution, the distinction between deterrent capabilities and capabilities that were warfighting tools was actually quite narrow. If you have a conventional army that can win a war, it will probably also deter the other side from doing things that you don't necessarily want it to. And its utility remains the same across the spectrum of action. Whereas, as you rightly say, in the context of nuclear deterrence, if a capability has been used, in many ways it has failed in its primary function.
When we talk about deterrence, that mostly involves strategic nuclear weapons, right, which tend to be bigger or involve a longer range missile. But we're now also seeing a rise in what's known as tactical weapons, and they have smaller yields and shorter ranges and can be used more precisely on the battlefield to gain a tactical advantage. Why are countries such as Russia increasingly building tactical nuclear weapons? Are they actually intended to be used?
I'd say in Europe in particular, at the end of the Cold War, there was a slight inversion of roles between Russia and NATO. Russia suddenly found itself the conventionally weaker side, and it had to think long and hard about what it would have to do in the event that a conflict with NATO broke out. In the late 1990s, the scenario that most worried the Russian leadership was a war along the lines of those that occurred in the former Yugoslavia, where a separatist movement received support from outside. And so in 1999, the Russian army concluded its Zapad exercise with a simulated nuclear attack on NATO, in essence, almost emulating what NATO had done in the context of the Cold War. Now, Russian thinking on the subject was relatively nascent at the time, but through the 90s and 2000s, there was a significant theoretical and intellectual effort in Russia to conceptualize how Russia could use nuclear weapons, one of the last areas in which it truly remains a superpower, to cover a wider range of bases, how they could get more utility out of its nuclear weapons. And from this emerged the ideas of, the flexible use of nuclear weapons as a coercive capability to inflict assigned or predetermined damage upon an opponent in a regional or a large-scale war. That's enough damage to give an opponent pause and to soberize it in Russian parlance, but not so much that it would necessarily extend into a full-scale nuclear war. Now, in the context of the war in Ukraine, some of these ideas were tested, and it's been a mixed result for the Russians. On the one hand, they haven't faced a direct NATO intervention in Ukraine, which they arguably would have if they were a non-nuclear power. On the other hand, they haven't been able to completely deter NATO from supporting Ukraine in other ways, indirectly. And so there's been a further discussion spurred in Moscow about how best to leverage nuclear weapons in a strategic role. Now, the problem for NATO in all of this is that Russia now has a pretty insurmountable lead in numbers of theater range as opposed to strategic nuclear weapons aimed at the US, and that this gives it a degree of flexibility should it choose to employ its nuclear weapons as a coercive tool, either, to terminate a conflict on favorable terms, or if it chooses to employ them as a war-fighting tool, as a purely military asset to do things that it assesses it really can't do in a war with conventional weapons, suppressing major air bases and conducting attacks on naval formations being two good examples. And so NATO is having to think quite long and hard about how it reintroduces a degree of flexibility into its own nuclear thinking, because currently there's a bit of a gap in the Allied escalation ladder. We have, pretty credible conventional options and pretty credible strategic options, but that capacity to sort of operate in between those two rungs of the escalation ladder has somewhat atrophied since the Cold War.
And part of that atrophy, right, has been the collapse of all of these various treaties. I won't run through all of them, but a bunch were signed in the 70s and have since not been renewed or have collapsed. Or, for example, with the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, the INF Treaty, which we'll talk about shortly, the US pulled out in 2019 under Trump in his first administration. And the only treaty we have left now is New START, which is set to expire in February, right, and doesn't look likely to be renewed. Why have all of these treaties been allowed to collapse? How has the sort of thinking around this shifted to the extent that these weapons that were once seen as sort of world-ending are no longer seen as something that we should regulate, but something that people should start hoarding again?
So I'd say there's a few factors that have led to the collapse of these treaties. The first is the one I mentioned, that in certain respects, for Russia in particular, nuclear weapons, especially at the theater level, were a sine qua non for its ability to deter and to potentially coerce a conventionally stronger alliance. And so before 2019, it had engaged in a number of programs, the SSC-8 ground-launched cruise missile and the RS-26, the intermediate range ballistic missile, which were either skirted the edges of legality in the case of the ballistic missile, or were just downright treaty non-compliant in the case of the SSC-8. So Russia's had strong structural incentives for non-compliance with the treaty, which in turn, of course, eventually drove a conversation in the US about what benefits unilateral compliance was actually bringing. And the problem of unilateral compliance for the US was twofold. It's not just that the INF, as it was before 2019, was imposing a rather asymmetrical dynamic where Russia was breaking the rules and the US thus far had not. It's also that as a bilateral treaty, it was somewhat structurally problematic in a three-power world where China, a country that had never signed the INF, was entirely free in the Pacific to build what is now the world's largest arsenal of medium and intermediate range ballistic missiles. Now, China's medium and intermediate range arsenal, missiles like the DF-21D and DF-26, are actually not nuclear capabilities. They're much more relevant to conventional operations like attacks on American air bases and aircraft carriers. But these capabilities, they would confer considerable advantages on each power in the Asia-Pacific, and the US was effectively, until the pullout from the INF, banned from constructing them. So in addition to Russia's non-compliance, there was the factor of, treaties that were built for a two-power world just being structurally unsuited to a three-power dynamic. And I think that, extends over to the question of why New START is unlikely to be renewed as well. It's the case that in a three-power context, arguably the structural incentives for the US to limit numbers of launchers or numbers of deployed warheads are considerably lessened because it faces the prospect of a Sino-Russian entente or alliance that collectively has considerably more nuclear weapons than the US. But equally, if you're China or Russia, you see this quite differently because both the Russians and the Chinese have for a long time said it's not just nuclear weapons that matter. It's also conventional weapons that can have a role in a nuclear campaign. So, for example, a conventional missile that destroys a command post ahead of a nuclear strike, or a conventional missile that can strike an elusive target like an ICBM TEL, transporter erector launcher, before it launches. And that when you look at the aggregate, rather than just nuclear warheads, it's the US that has the advantages against Russia or China taken independently. So each of these countries has a structural incentive to increase its own capabilities in the nuclear area, partially as a means of mitigating their vulnerabilities. And, that is arguably one rationale for the Chinese buildup. But when they do, they create a situation where the US is confronted with the specter of an opposing alliance with nuclear superiority, even if they never coordinate their capabilities per se. So I'd say, the biggest issue, even more important than Russian non-compliance, especially on the INF side, was that the world in which these treaties were signed no longer exists.
So Russia withdrawing from essentially the vestiges of this INF treaty this week is not that significant in and of itself, just a symptom of a wider shift that's happening. It's already been underway for a while.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, before the US's pullout of the INF, the Russians had already developed non-compliant capabilities. Last year, they used a non-compliant capability, the Orezhnik ballistic missile, which is a derivative of the RS-26 in Ukraine. The US, for its part, has said that in 2026, it will be deploying intermediate-range missiles, Dark Eagle, which is a hypersonic glide vehicle, and Typhoon, a ground-launched cruise missile launch system in Germany under Multi-Domain Task Force 2. So, in any concrete sense, both sides had left the treaty behind a long time ago. This is really almost just a ratification of reality.
And are these all intermediate-range missiles that you've mentioned, the Typhoon, the Dark Eagle, the Orezhnik?
Yes. So Typhoon would technically fall into the category of medium rather than intermediate range, but it would still be a missile that under the INF would have been non-compliant because it has a range greater than 500 kilometers and less than 5,500, which was the terms of the treaty.
Is this a class of missiles that we should be more worried about because the warning time is less, right? We hear a lot about ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles. Those are always the sort of terrifying ones that North Korea is testing. But is it intermediate range missiles that are actually more worrying?
Intermediate range missiles, and this was one of the rationales for the INF Treaty, are worrying for both sides precisely because they can shorten warning times, enable attacks on command posts, and act as a breaching capability for other systems. The question of who they're more worrying for, however, is an interesting one, because as much as the Russians railed against, the INF and essentially skirted around the edges of it, they had arguably more to lose from its demise because, from Germany, for example, something like Dark Eagle would really shorten their warning times, which is why during the Cold War they were so worried about Pershing II, which was one of the reasons, and Griffon, the sort of antecedent to Typhoon, which eventually compelled the Soviets to sign the INF. So in certain respects, the Russians arguably have a bit more to lose from this than the US does. And that's true of the Chinese as well. That is one advantage of the US maintaining a forward posture and a number of alliances, is that it has a certain amount of strategic depth that its opponents lack.
Before we move on, I want to pick you up on another word that crops up a lot, and that's posture. What is a nuclear posture?
A nation's nuclear posture is the way in which it distributes its capabilities, the ways in both in terms of missiles, but also warheads, the way in which it manages warheads, so how many are centralized versus, mated to launch platforms at any given time, and the command and control then the command and control mechanisms that it maintains for oversight and an ultimate delegation of authority regarding things like launch.
So basically, where its nuclear weapons are and the capabilities that they have in any given moment.
Where its nuclear weapons are, the capabilities they have at any given moment, the question of who can authorize launch. So some nations maintain negative controls where, there are technical barriers to employing nuclear weapons at any given time, whether that's, warheads not being maintained or permissive action links having to be extended from a centralized authority. Others maintain different mechanisms for control in order to ensure that even if command authorities are degraded, nuclear weapons can still be used. So those are the sorts of things that fall under the rubric of nuclear posture.
We're going to take a little pause there. Coming up after the break, what should we make of Trump's threat to move nuclear submarines towards Russia? Welcome back. That brings us on nicely to the events of late last week. In response to Dmitry Medvedev, the Russian national security advisor, I think these days, but former president of Russia, issued some very typically sort of bizarre and confrontational statements, but he invoked this dead hand system that Russia has. And in response to all these threats, I'm using sort of air quotes here because Medvedev says a lot of stuff all the time, Trump said that he was moving American nuclear submarines. It wasn't clear whether they're nuclear powered or had nuclear weapons on, but we sort of assume nuclear weapons, I suppose. That he was moving nuclear submarines into the appropriate positions. What did you make of that whole incident?
It's difficult to be sure for now because there's a whole lot of unknowns, one of which you mentioned, the fact that we don't know whether he meant nuclear-powered or submarines or SSBNs with nuclear weapons on them. It's also the case that the US always maintains SSBNs at sea, and while we don't know exactly where they are, it would be reasonable to assume a certain number of them are within launching range of Russia. So, was this Trump just badging something that was already occurring as a bold move on his part, or was there an actual reallocation of resources? It's difficult to say with any certainty.
Is it unprecedented for an American president to declare the country's nuclear posture, to talk openly about sort of allocation of assets, stuff that's normally kept quite secretive?
So it's not unprecedented in the sense that changes to things like nuclear alert have been used as coercive signals before. So, for example, during the Yom Kippur War, when Brezhnev was threatening to directly intervene in the war, the Nixon administration and primarily Henry Kissinger put the US nuclear forces on a higher state of alert basically as a signal to the Soviets of the consequences that could emerge from this. So nuclear signaling and changing things like the alert status or the positioning of forces as a message to the adversary is not necessarily unheard of. It's pretty unusual and probably unprecedented that it happens on social media of all things. Granted, he didn't give away details as such, but the underlying principle of nuclear signaling is not something fundamentally unprecedented, even though the way in which he's chosen to do it is pretty unusual.
All of this comes in the wake of the UK and France signing this Northwood Agreement, which is unprecedented and really signals greater nuclear cooperation between Europe's only two nuclear powers. Do you think this is part of a shift towards more countries wanting to use nuclear weapons and wanting to trumpet their use more?
The two nuclear deterrents that exist at a European level, not counting American dual-capable aircraft, in some ways uncoordinated. And Europe collectively will have to contemplate a world, maybe not now, but 10 years from now, where the US is deterring two nuclear peers, China and Russia, and the traditional American nuclear strategy of damage limitation, which essentially presupposed that if a nuclear war was unavoidable, the US could and would try to destroy as much of an opponent's arsenal before launch as possible, will no longer be viable against two arsenals which collectively are larger than that of the US. In that context, there is a question about the credibility of extended deterrence if the Americans are forced more and more to confront, what the Soviets call the old Washington for Bonn question. Would you trade Washington for Bonn during the Cold War? And there is a question about how European nuclear arsenals can be coordinated either to cope with the possibility of a reallocation of American resources or to close the margin of difference, shall we say, between the US's commitments and its available capabilities, particularly in Europe. Now, I don't think that this agreement necessarily takes us all the way there. The French are still very, have, as a matter of policy, have always viewed the forced dissuasion as a national asset, not an alliance asset. And things like integrated planning are still a long, long way away, even though France has now, as it has in the past, said that its defense has a European dimension and that the UK and France's vital interests are inseparable from one another. But what it represents is at least a step in the direction, I think, of the two European nuclear arsenals being employed as an alliance asset rather than, especially in the case of the French arsenal, a purely national capability. There's also questions around, the costs and difficulties of maintaining some of these capabilities where, nuclear coordination could be used to backfill some of this. But it should be said that right now there's been no fundamental shift in terms of nuclear planning. There is a steering group, but this is all, everything I've discussed right now is very much in the future. This represents sort of a tentative step in that direction, I'd say.
But I guess it is a recognition of the fact that nuclear weapons are increasingly playing a role in, as you mentioned, sort of deterring more conventional conflicts. And I guess I'm thinking of Israel and Iran that we saw earlier this year. Israel striking Iran, which it said was on the cusp of developing nuclear weapons. And it's unclear how much damage has been done to Iran's nuclear program, which it maintains as for civilian purposes, but is widely believed to have crossed what would reasonably be considered viable for civilian purposes. It feels like Iran may now, some experts have suggested, may now be pushed in the direction of finally going ahead with developing nuclear weapons, which is something that, by all accounts, the leadership had not yet signed off on to deter a future conflict like that. And then we've also seen India and Pakistan trading conventional blows, but they're both nuclear-armed states. You have the example of North Korea, which has developed nuclear weapons in spite of all of these sanctions and treaties which you've mentioned, and now feels quite fortress-like. It would be foolish to attack North Korea. That regime has secured its survival, at least for the moment. And somewhere like Ukraine, which you mentioned earlier, gave up its nuclear weapons in the 90s and is now facing the full-scale force of the Russian conventional army. How do we factor nuclear weapons into what feels like an increasingly war-driven environment geopolitically?
I suppose for some states, what nuclear weapons represent is fundamentally a means of ensuring themselves against existential threat, if not to the state, then at least to a regime. And that very much seems to be the character of the North Korean nuclear arsenal, which, is fundamentally driven by the fear of regime change, a fear that was reinforced by, events in 2003 in Iraq, amongst other things, and then Libya down the line. And it should be said, particularly with small nuclear arsenals, without that sort of flexibility that the Russian, the Chinese, and the American arsenals have, it's quite difficult to use nuclear weapons coercively. One can only really use them when there is an existential threat. So their actual utility as a tool is still considerable, but it's quite bounded by those scenarios. However, what is of interest is that the ability to ensure oneself against certain kinds of conventional threats can also embolden a state to engage in competition of a limited scale whilst daring its conventionally stronger opponent to do anything about it, in the knowledge that its nuclear weapons are an insurance against conventional punishment. And that's very much been, the dynamic with India and Pakistan for many years now, since the two states went nuclear, where, Pakistan's possession of nuclear weapons meant that it could sponsor state-backed terror on the Indian side and essentially deter the Indian military from a conventional response. And that's forced the Indian side to think much harder about how it sort of engages in conventional retaliation to sub-threshold provocations than one would predict looking purely at the conventional balance of forces between the two states. And in many ways, that kind of links to the Middle East, where, the greatest fear for a lot of Middle Eastern states regarding an Iranian nuclear weapon was not necessarily that the regime in Tehran would use it the day that they had it, but rather that the possession of a nuclear weapon and insurance against certain kinds of conventional attack, for example, the sort of attack that the Israelis mounted not long ago, would embolden the Iranian regime to become much more aggressive in its use of proxies and other forms of coercion than it otherwise would have been. So at one level, you could say nuclear weapons in this sort of quite contested environment are, at least as far as the use case goes, just insurance against the worst types of threats, a full-scale invasion or regime change. But on the other hand, that very insurance makes them an enabler for all sorts of other activities that a state might have otherwise considered too risky based on its conventional capabilities.
A lot of people have been comparing this moment or recent moments to Cuban Missile Crisis. Is that fair?
The Cuban Missile Crisis represented a very acute crisis where, individual decisions could have set off, frankly, a powder keg. Had Kennedy opted for a bombing operation rather than a quarantine, for example, or had a Soviet vessel or submarine been sunk in the Caribbean. I don't think there's any sort of standoff right now in the world that I could see necessarily emulating the same dynamics. Arguably, there were parts of the recent Indo-Pakistani clash which came close, but, for the most part, what we're seeing is much more of a structural build-up of capabilities in a way that reinforces tension. So if I were to use a Cold War analogy, I'd probably say we're closer to the point in the 70s where the Soviet nuclear buildup essentially brought it to nuclear parity with the United States. And so essentially, at a very structural level, the nuclear balance of power changed in ways that then, forced everybody to adapt their postures and strategies accordingly.
Does this structural change make us safer or put the whole world in more danger? I mean, the answer in some respects seems obvious. More nuclear weapons sounds more dangerous. But if more countries have more nuclear weapons and there's more deterrence and the stakes of any kind of conflict become higher and higher, does that in some ways protect us from, for example, we're speaking on the week of the 80th anniversary of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The impact of those bombings to end World War II in Japan was horrific. 200,000 people died, 70,000 people on the spot on those days, and others from the after effects of those bombs. With so many countries now nuclear armed, does it feel impossible that something like that would happen again, given the domino effect that it would set off?
It's an interesting question, right? Because on the one hand, the possession of nuclear weapons can deter large-scale conventional war, which in its own way can be very horrific. I mean, to go to the Hiroshima and Nagasaki example, 800,000 people died of fire bombings between March and August 1945. So, you can do the same things that a nuclear weapon can achieve less efficiently with conventional weapons. And so there is something to be said for the pacifying effect of nuclear weapons. It's a large part of the reason there wasn't a conventional war in Europe during the Cold War, for example. But there are two factors to consider. The first factor is precisely the one you mentioned, the dynamic where in the second nuclear age, as opposed to the first, we're not looking at a world of two nuclear powers facing off against each other, which is a relatively stable and predictable bipolar dynamic, though there were big crises like the Cuban Missile Crisis or Able Archer 83. What we're looking at is a world of multiple nuclear powers, each of which, in its efforts to ensure its own security, incentivizes the other side to take measures which don't just potentially reduce its security, but also reduce the security of a third power. And so it sets off a rather competitive dynamic. The second factor is that the fear of nuclear counterforce, the idea that one's own nuclear weapons could be destroyed before launch, is a very real one, particularly for the Russians and the Chinese. And it can incentivize countries to take measures to ensure themselves against counterforce posture that in their own way can be very destabilizing, creating capabilities like, the nuclear torpedo, the Poseidon, which the Russians have created, which is arguably a harder capability to control, or changing their command and control structures to provide reversionary mechanisms, which can also be destabilizing in a crisis. So there is the risk of crisis instability. And the second risk, of course, is the risk that a nuclear-armed revisionist state feels emboldened to do things it might not have otherwise done. Case in point, being Russia in Ukraine, where, nuclear weapons have allowed Russia to invade, not quite with impunity, but with fewer consequences than it might have otherwise suffered. In the case of the North Korean, South Korean dynamic as well, though there's been a bit more stability on the Korean peninsula, North Korea's been able to do a range of things, arm Russia, send troops to fight in Kursk, which arguably it might have been less willing to do and more leery of the risks of doing if it wasn't insured against certain consequences. So, there is also the risk of the so-called stability-instability paradox, where, stability at one level, the fact that most powers feel insured against really major war if they have nuclear weapons, also lends itself to instability at the lower levels, because precisely due to that fact, countries feel they can compete or coerce in limited ways without worrying that things will spiral out of their control. But even so, I'd say on balance, nuclear weapons are probably as good an insurance policy as the world has against, large-scale conventional war between major powers. And then that is, in certain respects, a positive thing. Do
you think we're entering a nuclear arms race in which we'll see more countries acquire nuclear weapons? I'm thinking of, for example, Germany, Japan, Iran.
Iran's acquisition of a nuclear weapon, they have the incentive to do so, but there are questions around their capability now. They do maintain probably a lot of their stockpile of uranium enriched to 60%, but the capacity to do things like convert it to uranium metal was pretty much destroyed at Isfahan. But also, critically, there's a gap that every country faces when it goes nuclear, which is the period between when it has a viable nuclear device, it's conducted a test, and where it has a survivable nuclear arsenal with enough warheads distributed on enough launch platforms that the other side can't just destroy it on the ground, nip the problem in the bud. Now, North Korea got through that period because even though there was every incentive to limit its capacity to go nuclear militarily, it had enough artillery north of the demilitarized zone to kill a huge number of people in Seoul. And so it was understood that the consequences of doing this were simply too great, and people did it for better or for worse, and North Korea crossed that period, and it now arguably has a very robust or relatively robust nuclear capability. Iran arguably had something similar in the form of Hezbollah, but that is now gone. And so its ability to cross that transition period to a nuclear capability is arguably more limited. In the case of Germany and Japan, I would be very surprised if either or both countries went nuclear per se. But what I think both countries will do is invest in conventional deep strike capabilities that they can use in a manner not necessarily identical to nuclear weapons, but that can be used to offset an adversary's threat of nuclear weapons use, either by the threat of using these capabilities in conjunction with the US and potentially the US nuclear arsenal, or using conventional punishment as a threat against, limited nuclear use. Whether that's, a viable deterrent or not is a subject for some debate, but I would see that as being the direction of travel for both countries.
Is there anywhere else you think that might want to develop nuclear weapons that we haven't talked about?
The big one would be South Korea, whether they view themselves as potentially requiring a nuclear weapon. So for a long time, the South Korean deterrent against North Korean use, in addition to the alliance with the US, was a so-called three-axis deterrent concept, which was comprised of three things: the so-called kill chain, the ability to destroy North Korean nuclear weapons on the ground; integrated air and missile defense, ideally to intercept a warhead if it was launched; and conventional massive retaliation, which was essentially the use of conventionally armed deep strike capabilities like the Hyunmoo ballistic missile to destroy targets of particular value to the North Korean regime. And I think implicitly the threat was always to kill North Korea's leadership. Now, that was viable, I'd say, for as long as South Korea maintained absolute technological dominance over the North. Things like control of the skies, which I think the South Koreans did and still can effect, especially in conjunction with the US. There is an interesting question, not for maybe not now, but 10 or 15 years from now, where if North Korea's relationship with the Russians, which is now burgeoned, results in them getting more robust air defenses, for example, as well as more modern capabilities in other areas, whether the South Koreans view that conventional offset to nuclear threats as remaining viable, or whether they view themselves as requiring a nuclear weapon of their own. So I'd say the Korean Peninsula is one to watch in both respects, although I don't necessarily view nuclearization of South Korea as something imminent.
Just going back to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the payload of those bombs that were dropped, how does that compare to the nuclear weapons that Russia and America could drop today?
Vastly lower. So, for example,
vastly lower. Would they count as like a sort of tactical weapon in today's talking terms?
Yeah, so 15 kilotons was the payload of the bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima, for example. By comparison, the W-88 warhead that could go on an American SLBM has a payload of several hundred kilotons. So, there's a pretty substantial difference there. As you say, they probably would count more as tactical weapons in today's context. And in some ways, that does illustrate perhaps that there's something to the Russian categorization of tactical versus strategic based on use rather than yield, because really it's more a question of what you use something against that determines whether it's tactical or strategic.
Several hundred kilotons, that sounds like enough to wipe out a small country.
So not quite. So if you really did want to wipe out a country, this was fairly well gamed out during the Cold War. And the assumption was, there were two differing sort of estimates reached. So there was the McNamara criterion, which was reached under the tenure of Robert McNamara, as you might have guessed, in the 60s, which assumed you would need around 400 high-yield warheads, so warheads of several hundred kiloton plus, to effectively ensure that the Soviet Union could never return to industrialized living again. Harold Brown, the Secretary of Defense under Jimmy Carter, reduced that criteria to about 200. But even so, you if you were targeting a country, and you really were planning on wiping it out, you probably would need quite a substantial number of nuclear weapons. But equally, even a small number of nuclear weapons being used over a state would, certainly change its existence in very fundamental ways if, they were targeted against, cities or that sort of critical cities or that sort of thing.
Just finally, does it scare you talking about all of this stuff? Does it feel quite theoretical still, or does the prospect of nuclear bombs being used or even a nuclear war? Does that feel like we are getting closer to that? I know we've got this clock that's constantly moving forward closer to midnight.
Yeah. I mean, in some ways, I would say there's room for both caution and optimism. So there's room for caution because, as we discussed, the second nuclear age is far more complex than the first in critical ways. It's far more multipolar. But on the other hand, we have far more institutional knowledge today than we did in the early Cold War when these weapons were first introduced on both sides. There have been enough near misses through the Cold War that both sides, I think, understand the ramifications at play. There is also the restraining effect that nuclear weapons have, which is a bit of a mixed blessing. On the one hand, it can embolden revisionists, which is less than ideal, but it also does make major power war and warfare at a very high level of conventional intensity less likely. And conventional wars can be extraordinarily destructive things themselves, going back to the comparison of the impact of firebombs in places like Tokyo versus the nuclear weapons. So yeah, I would say there's grounds for concern, absolutely, but that there are also grounds for not necessarily optimism, but recognizing the ability to control these dynamics and the ability to leverage them for something positive in certain instances.
We'll leave it there. Dr. Sidharth Kaushal, thank you very much for joining us on Battlelines.
Thank you for having me.
That's all for today's episode. We'll be back again on Monday. Until then, goodbye. Battlelines is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Knowles and hosted by me, Venetia Rainey, and Roland Oliphant. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Battlelines on your preferred podcast app. And if you have a moment, leave a review, as it really helps others find the show. To stay on top of all of our news, subscribe to The Telegraph, sign up to our Dispatches newsletter, or listen to our sister podcast, Ukraine the Latest. You can get in touch directly by emailing battlelines@telegraph.co.uk or contact us on X. You can find our handles in the show notes. The producer is Peter Shevlin. The executive producer is Louisa Wells.